here today from Cornell University, where she's a professor. I'm finding it a little bit hard to summarize for everyone here exactly what Lillian does, because she has worked in really a whole variety of areas of natural language processing. So she's done work on parsing, distributional similarity of words, social sentiment analysis, and sort of NLP applied to analysis of social dynamics and things like politics and online media. And the only thing I can really think of to say that connects all of these things together is that Lillian's papers on whatever she writes on are really consistently extremely interesting and influential. And so I will let her tell you more about what she's working on right now.
Thank you. Okay, hi. It's good to see some familiar faces. Thank you for this introduction. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm really pleased to be here. It's a great place. I'm going to start with the sort of trite observation that there are lots of online conversations out there. There are the obvious ones, things like what are happening on Twitter and Facebook. There are maybe less obvious ones, comments on blogs, forum conversations between people, and even arguably, say, if you look at something like review aggregation sites like Yelp or arguably Amazon, there are actually interesting interactions going on between the users there. Given that we have all this conversational data going around, I would argue that this means that there are many systems out there that have both humans and language use as key components of them. And this means that there are fantastic opportunities, I think, for the combination of natural language processing and the social sciences. And these opportunities include the ability to improve such systems and to create new ones. So that's clearly the wind-up to the talk here. I'm going to demonstrate this idea through two case studies. So what I'm going to first show you here are sort of the 30-second movie trailer versions of what we're going to talk about, and then move on to the actual talk. So this is like the movie trailer version of my outline. So in the first case study can be illustrated by this picture here and this question, who's in charge? So this picture here shows an argument before the Supreme Court. It's an artist's rendering of the Obamacare hearings. If I asked you who's in charge and you looked at this, it would be obvious. Scalia is up here. He's higher than this person here, who's the Solicitor General. He's seated. This person's standing. He's wearing a robe. He's just got regular clothes on. You can just look and you know who's in charge. But what if I didn't give you these visual signals, but rather I said all you get to look at is their language? And I'm not going to even let you hear their intonation or everything. It's going to be their transcripts, the written transcripts of their speech. And furthermore, I'm going to go even further, and I'm going to take out all the content words. So all, suppose you get, to answer this question, are redacted transcripts of what these two people are saying, where there's nothing left but the function words. Could you even, in this incredibly impoverished signal, tell who's in charge? Not surprisingly, I'm going to argue yes, and we'll see so in later on in the talk. So that's going to be my first study, asking whether there are relations, can we, from this impoverished language signal, tell who's in charge in a particular conversation. One reason we might do this impoverished signal is that, you know, if you don't have content words there, if you don't have domain-specific words, then you might hope that your techniques would translate to other domains. So can anyone guess what this is supposed to represent? Probably not. I'm not an artist, as you can tell. That's the Wikipedia globe. This is a Wikipedian. So my idea here is that we have this domain-independent analysis that could apply not just to conversations between Supreme Court justices and solicitors general, who you don't tend to run into on the street, but things like Wikipedians having conversations on a totally different topic in a totally different modality. They're online as opposed to offline. They're not face-to-face. They're asynchronous, etc. Okay, so that's that's one reason why we're going to try using this impoverished channel. Second, just the intellectual challenge of it. I think it's quite fascinating to ask, what kind of information are we leaking to each other through even subtle signals like our choice of function words? Okay? All right. Then there's going to be a second case study, again looking at intersections between natural language processing and social interaction. This asks a different question, something I've been fascinated for a while, is that does phrasing affect the memorability of things that people say? Or is it all language external factors? Let me illustrate what I mean by going through a historical example. In the run-up to the 2008 elections in the US, Obama said this thing, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. Something strange that happened with this is that this phrase, lipstick on a pig, got picked up by the press. A lot of people started talking about it. It was a matter of national conversation. Okay, and you might ask, why is that? And I, as a language person, would love to say it's because lipstick on a pig is a really striking thing to say. It's unusual. It just sticks out in one's mind. It's very memorable because of the way it puts together two, quite distinct kind of concepts. You'd like to argue that that was just such a cool phrase, it's great that it got picked up. On the other hand, I would tell my political scientist friends about this, and they'd be like, you are nuts. What happened is that there's no language effect at all. Rather, Sarah Palin earlier had made this joke about, what's the difference between a hockey mom and a pit bull? Lipstick, right? So she had made this reference about herself, in a way, and about lipstick, and the argument among the political scientists is the problem is that what Obama was saying with lipstick on a pig appeared to be a reference, potentially derogatory, about Palin. So there was nothing about how he said something. It was simply, it happened to coincidentally resonate with something that Sarah Palin had said, something that was out there in the culture already. So it could be that there's absolutely no language effect whatsoever to that phrase catching on and being distributed across the interwebs. It was all this cultural context. Okay, and they could well be right. They're smart people and they're political scientists and all the like. So that could be the actual explanation, but it is also possible that wording had an effect. So we would like to do a study where we could say, is there a way we can test whether wording has an effect where the possible contextual, the sort of cultural context of what else is going on can be controlled for? Okay. And it would seem like that can't happen because language always appears in a context, and I'm hoping to show you in a case study later on that, in fact, we can control for these factors. Okay? Finally, a word about presentation. Speaking of influence, this is something my advisor, Stuart Schieber, said to me a while ago, and as I get older and older, I take it more to heart. He said, your goal when you're presenting some work or writing about it in a paper or whatever is not to convince, oh, and by the way, I'm paraphrasing him because his style is inimitable, but it actually goes on for a while, so I needed to fit on the slide. He said that your goal is not to convince your audience that you are brilliant, but that your solution is trivial. Okay, there are repercussions to this, and often, I think many of you are graduate students. This may seem really weird to you. You're probably like, the whole point of grad school is to prove how brilliant I am in seminars or whatever, right? And this is saying you shouldn't do that. Okay, so Stuart goes on to say it takes a certain strength of character to take that as one's goal, and not to be so self-aggrandizing or whatever, but this is actually true. You won't get your papers rejected more often if you write this way. You have fewer people saying you're smart, you have people saying your work is obvious, you didn't do anything. Okay? So why should you do this? Well, it depends. If your goal is, in fact, to make everyone think you're brilliant, then this is a bad strategy. But if your goal is actually to add to the body of knowledge of what we know to be true, if you're trying to advance science, then argue that this is a good strategy, despite the personal pain you may suffer, because if people think your findings are obvious, they must also believe you are correct. Okay. And my presentation, you may, from my presentation, decide, in fact, I am not that bright. But let me tell you that the simplicity of this presentation is at least on purpose. Okay. Let me move on. All right. So first case study, Echoes of Power. This is going to be talking, this is the, again, have this little picture in mind of trying to tell who's in charge based on these redacted transcripts. This is joint work with various Cornellians and ex-Cornellians. My former student, Cristian Dănescu Niculescu Mizil. Took me 4 years to figure out how to pronounce that. Boapong, John Kleinberg's at Cornell now. And this was work published at WWW 2012. All right. So why care about being able to tell who's in charge from these redacted language transcripts? Well, first and foremost in my mind is that this is an interesting problem. Do we actually forecast our social hierarchies even in things like how we use prepositions? Okay. But if you're not motivated by the inherent interestingness of that scientific question, then I'd argue there are also some motivating applications. So something I've been thinking about would be sort of proactive task discussion management. So you hear a lot about polarization on the interwebs, people all flame each other and the like. It'd be kind of cool if, something like Facebook or something could actually notice that you guys are getting into a flame war and then maybe even intercede. I don't really think about sort of violent intercessions, but maybe even if it just slowed down your typing, maybe you could just calm down a little bit and, if the thing knew that it needed to calm down the people as they're talking, I think that might benefit humanity. Anyway. Moving along these lines, I sort of have a grander vision of conversation facilitation systems since so many of the conversations we have are, in fact, online. So I've just talked about diffusing imminent flame wars. This is something I've been kind of speculating about recently. You guys know about these massive online open courses or open online courses, I can never remember, where you're having a lot of people interacting with instructors or other students in a non-face-to-face setting, it'd be really great if you could understand, okay, we've got students now, they're not understanding what's going on, they're disengaged, and to pull them back in. And remember that you don't have all the social cues that you have in the face-to-face setting. Another application would be an e-government. This is something colleagues at Cornell, including Claire Carty and Dan Cogley, are thinking about. The Obama administration has been stressing transparent government, right? They've been trying to get more citizen input. They want people to know, talk to their government, tell them what's going on. Is that a question? Yeah. Yep.
How does being able to know who's in charge, being able to tell who's in charge, help you?
So that's that big little that arrow there. So actually, a lot of this is actually motivated by life in my faculty meetings regularly. So sometimes things aren't going well, where it seems like maybe too many people think they're in charge, or no one's in charge, and things like that. And those are signs that something has gone wrong with the conversation. Maybe the wrong person seems to be in charge. So I'm not saying that being in charge directly comes to this kind of thing, although maybe in flame wars, you've got both people appearing to be in charge, that would be an issue. It's sort of a broader set of things. But I think that being able to tell who's in charge or not should be it's a hard problem, but easy enough that if you could do it, then you could start thinking, really, we could build these conversational facilitation systems that we'd love to have around. Other questions? Okay. Let me skip this and just go on with that. So remember, the question is, can we tell from language who's in charge? And I really miss having Fred Jelinek around for many reasons, but now would be a great time to talk about who's in charge and language use, but alas. So in some cases, it's really easy. So here's an example. I have two people talking. The first person says, "Your Honor, I agree." The second person says, "Thank you." It is obvious from the honorific here that this person is in charge of this situation, right? This is an easy case. I put this up, if nothing else, to introduce a color coding scheme. So when I have purple speech balloons, it means someone is talking to someone of higher status. They're talking to the royal purple, if you will. And I'm using green. You can think of it as when you're talking to someone of lower status, you're talking to a greenhorn, something like that. I tried, but try to keep that in mind. Okay. Now, this is a Supreme Court setting. That's not, again, the typical situation we find ourselves in, but here's a maybe more typical example drawn from the Enron data set, the Enron emails. That's a corporate setting where you had people who are higher in the org chart, people who are lower in the org chart talking to each other. And Eric Gilbert, among others, did a study of looking at the kind of phrases that tend to signal position in a social hierarchy. So, for instance, if someone says, "I'd like to get your thoughts on this when you are available," the purple means they're talking to someone of higher status, which makes sense, right? Again, here's where I would have liked to use Fred as my straight man here. When someone says, "Let's discuss later," they are probably in charge, talking to someone who's of lower status. Okay. So again, these are easy examples, but they're sort of domain specific. This is definitely Supreme Court-y talk. This is corporate speak. Okay. Can we get to more general domain independent signals from the language? Okay. So Niederhofer and Pennebaker, two psychologists, said something that I've found really striking. I think this is memorably phrased. They said that communicative behaviors are patterned and coordinated, like a dance. Okay? So if we push on that metaphor a little bit, we can say, well, if I were looking at people and they were dancing, I could ask who has the lead, which is like the question, who is in charge? Okay, and if I wanted to know that, I would look at the two people, and I might notice this is Uma Thurman and John Travolta in Pulp Fiction. I might notice that maybe every time Uma makes a move, John Travolta responds. He doesn't necessarily mirror her, but he's responding immediately to what she's doing. Okay, and that would give me a clue that Uma is in the lead. Okay, so if we now take that to push it to conversation and ask who has the conversational lead, then I might say, well, let's look at their language. And again, suppose I'm going to talk about their function word usage, again, just because I'm using these redacted transcripts, then I might say, well, I notice that Uma is using a preposition, then a determiner, and John in the immediate reply is also using a preposition and a determiner. Not the same one. Okay, so I'm not asking that they're mimicking the exact language, but they are matching in function class usage. Okay, that's what I'm going to look for. And those might be the signs that one of them is in charge, because the other one is mimicking their function class usage, just in the way that when people are dancing, the one person echoes the person who has the lead. Well, reacts to the person who has the lead. Okay? Yeah? I got it in a couple slides. I'll give you a definition. But yeah, in fact, what are we going to look at? So we're definitely going to look at an asymmetric adaptation. You assume that the people who are lower down in the social hierarchy or whatever might do more echoing than someone that's higher up. And we're going to look at linguistic style, as I said before. We're not going to look at the content word echoing, if you will, but on this function word business. So let me push on that a little harder. So when we define linguistic style coordination, which is your question, how are you going to measure this thing, one thing we're not going to do, you could, but for the purposes of what we're trying to get at, we didn't. We're not going to look at direct repetition. Okay. Sometimes if Fred said, we will use context-free grammars, and I robotically repeat, yes, we will use context-free grammars, that would be a sign of someone being in control. But that is under the speaker's control. Okay, whereas I'm interested in these sort of subconscious signals because that's something the speaker can't mask. Like I might be, if I was trying to, goodness knows, talk back to Fred, I might try to assert control through my conscious behavior, but it's hard to believe that I could unconsciously modify my function word usage to match Fred's. Okay. Another point behind not using direct repetition is that that could be just a choice of topic. So let's say Adam and I were talking about bridge, say, it would be quite likely that he might use the word cards, I might use the word cards, he might say spades, I would say spades, whatever. That wouldn't be him influencing me because he's in charge. That would be we're using the same terms because there are certain terms you just have to use if you're talking about a particular topic. Okay, and what we're interested in here is the influence of one person over another, one person causing the other person to use particular words. Okay, so we want to control for that too. So again, what we're going to use is function class matching, and we're going to rely on Niederhofer and Pennebaker's finding is that this is unconscious, again, so it's not under the speaker's control, and that it's frequent. So some people say, how can you say this is unconscious? I have a little thought experiment I usually pull out at this point. How many prepositions did I just use in my previous sentence? Nobody knows? Aren't you paying attention? Aren't you coordinating with me? You don't know. I don't know. Wait, do you actually know? Raise your hand up. What? Maybe two? It's true. Maybe I use two. This is not something we keep track of. It's not something I even keep track of. It seems like we are not consciously able to even know how many function word classes we're using in a particular utterance. Why should I believe you can then control it consciously in order to mimic someone else? Okay. Just to give you an example of the kind of matching we might be looking for, this is another movie scene. This is Steve McQueen and Ally McGraw in The Getaway. I assume. We have Steve McQueen saying, at least you're outside. Ally McGraw responds, it doesn't make much difference. This is actually a script. This is an artificial conversation. Now, I'm using an artificial conversation to make this point that, in fact, this is a very unconscious and really buried in deep in us kind of thing. Because there is no true social interaction going on here. All this is happening in someone's head. Okay, and how did they imagine this conversation going? They've imagined that these two things are said. Now, notice that the screenwriter could have had Ally McGraw say, it doesn't really matter. Well, that's not important. These all say about the same thing, same information content. But the screenwriter chose this one instead. And what's special about this? Well, you'll notice that, at least according to Luke, this one has a quantifier, just like this has a quantifier. So we have this appearance of the same function class in the next utterance. Okay, it's not the same, but you still have a matching class. And it's also hard to believe that when the screenwriter wrote this line, they then said, okay, I got to make sure Ally McGraw uses a quantifier in the next sentence. That'd be kind of weird, right? Yeah? Couple nods. Right? So it seems like it's an unconscious thing, and this matching is happening even when people are imagining a conversation, which is kind of a striking fact, I would argue. All right, so let's talk about a little formula here. We want to measure this level of coordination, and let me describe it as follows. So the question we want to answer is, suppose I have two speakers, X1 and X2, and we're talking about a particular function word class C, say prepositions. I would like to know how much, when speaker X1 uses a preposition, this immediately triggers in X2's immediate response the use of a preposition as well. Okay. It'll be convenient for sort of terminological purposes to flip sort of the who's to kind of flip the x1 and x2 and say, how much does x2 coordinate to x1 on, say, prepositions? Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about, people coordinating to other people for the rest of this talk. So this is a measure introduced by Mr. W hyphenated last name et al. In WWW 2011. This part is the obvious part. Okay, so you would say, given that x1 used this preposition, say, and x2 is in the position of immediately replying, you might think that, well, to measure the phenomenon I'm looking for, which is this triggering thing, I simply say, given that, I want to know how much does x2 tend to use preposition in this situation. Okay. We're actually going to be more careful than that. We're going to subtract off this term. What are we trying to control for here? Well, for instance, maybe it's the case that whenever I talk to Adam, we just tend to use a lot of prepositions. It's not that he's causing me in my next. It's not that he's causing me in my next utterance to use prepositions. It happens to be just with him, I tend to use prepositions more often, even more often than I do with you. Okay, but it's still not an effect of him causing me to use the preposition in the next utterance, even if our sort of, what do you say, our relationship causes us to use prepositions overall. So I'm subtracting off this awfully fine-based quantity. I want to subtract off the probability that x2 uses C, given that x2 is talking to x1. So it can even be based on the actual identities of these human beings. Okay. So this is controlling for those factors. I usually do a pop quiz here to see how people are doing. Can this quantity be negative? I have a couple nods. A couple say yes. Do people say no? Some people are not sure. So just to reinforce concepts here, this can in fact go negative. It could be that I tend to use prepositions a lot with Adam, but I'm particularly angry with him today. So every time he uses a preposition, I refuse to use a preposition in the next sentence. Even though overall, when he doesn't use a preposition, I do use a preposition. Okay? So I'd have a high number here and a 0 here, and that would cause the thing to be negative. That's also possible. And may or may not happen. We'll have to keep track over lunch. Yeah?
So I have two questions. One is if you use like probabilities here, you have point-wise conditional mutual information. And so I wonder why you subtracted rather than ratio.
Ease of
It has to do with some notion of statistical significance. But
yeah, because we want to be able to actually look at, for sort of even debugging purposes, if you like, you really want to be able to eyeball this term to make sure what you're doing makes sense. What was the second question?
Oh, I said I thought maybe it had to do with worrying that a difference in a factor of 2 between two very small numbers
Also a problem.
It might not be significant.
Yeah.
But you can test the significance directly
Yep.
or something.
So I don't think it actually matters in the sense that, you know, as long as there's a difference in the one, there'll be a difference in the other. It's not like we actually... There would have certainly been no problem to use mutual information. We've talked about that as well. This one has actually some cute properties that are discussed in the paper, but they're a little technical. So I don't want to totally get into it now. But in actual effect...
Okay. Like there might be really rare words. Like in Federalist Papers, they looked at while versus whilst and so forth. Those don't have very high rates. And so if you're only looking for differences here that are large, the rare words are not going to come into play.
No, so
I guess it depends on how you aggregate this.
Yeah. Because of course we're using classes, remember, which causes the rare word problem to be dissolved in some, what do you say? There's some word for it that I'm failing some of, right? Yeah, so, and part of these, if you're conditioning on these very fine things, you get into trouble. So things like looking at the class actually makes sense. Yeah. All right, so this is the measure. It can go negative, it can go positive. This is what we're looking for. All right, so let's see some results. This is in the Supreme Court setting. So we have 50,000 conversational exchanges between various justices in the Supreme Court. I think it's like 5 years of data. I can't totally remember. In the Supreme Court setting, it's very clear who's in charge. If you're a justice, you're in charge. Oh, sorry. What this data is oral arguments before the Supreme Court. So in oral arguments, there's an attorney for the defense and there's an attorney for one side and an attorney for the other, and they're presenting their arguments to the Supreme Court justices. Okay, so it's not a civil hearing where you're questioning witnesses or the like. So in that setting, it's extremely clear who's in charge, right? The people in the robes sitting up there, the justices, they're in charge. The attorneys, they're not in charge. Okay, so it's very clear. We have gold standard labels. All right, what is this axis here? So this axis, these portions over here are different classes of function words. Okay, this stuff before the bar is an aggregation over these things, so let's concentrate mostly on these. Okay, so these are just 3 ways to aggregate over all the possible parts of speech class, all the function word classes that we're using. This axis here is level of coordination. Okay, so we've argued before that it could actually be negative. In this case, all the numbers that you see are actually positive. So it means everyone's coordinating to some degree with everybody else. However, here's the key distinction. Now here's my purple, royal purple versus greenhorn thing. You can ask, look at the court. So each purple bar means how much is someone of low status, an attorney, coordinating to someone of high status, a Supreme Court justice. And we have some bar here, compared to vice versa, when someone of high status, a justice, is talking to someone of low status, an attorney. And you see the gap between the bars. You can see it visually. And these things here, stars mark statistical significance of that difference. The usual star is 0.05, double star is 0.01, triple star is 0.001. Yeah. Where'd it go? It's, how do I check for an immediate reply?
So one of the conditions was
Yeah.
text to reply immediately.
Yeah, so the transcripts are just, they're written transcripts. So person A says something, then person B says something. That's an immediate reply. Okay. Other questions? Usually at this point, if people understand the graph, so the point is that we're seeing these statistically significant differences highly in the aggregate case between when someone's talking to someone of high status versus when someone's talking to someone of low status relative to them. Okay. And at this point, if everyone hasn't even just written me off, there's usually a couple of objections that arise. And in the purposes of time, I'll tell you what these objections usually are, and then hopefully I'll have data that overrides them. Number 1, that's all fine and good. So these are objections. Feel free to overrule them. Ha, ha, ha. Come on, guys. Give me a break. Either that or I won't let you go to lunch, damn it. Yeah, thank you. One objection is that this is all fine and good, but it's obvious and it deals with the Supreme Court, which is the world's most specialized case. You'd be like, you know, these are these weird question-answer formats. Of course the people have to echo the questions, and the justices are asking the questions, and the lawyers have to answer them. Or other sort of things. Maybe this happens in the Supreme Court, but it doesn't happen in sort of real life. Things like that. So that's one objection, is usually setting. Another objection is that, and this one's a little more subtle, so I like it a lot. I like it even better. This actually isn't about power, per se. It could be that it's sort of accidental that it correlates to power, but it's really about personality. Namely, hypothesis, people who become Supreme Court justices don't tend to repeat what other people say. Can you argue with me with that? In which case, this isn't about power. It's still a result. I still see it. But it's more about the types of people who become Supreme Court justices versus the types of people who don't get there. Okay, and so this doesn't really tell me anything about the social relationship between the two. Okay, and there's usually a third objection that comes out. Maybe Miles is about to give it to me.
So in this setup, everyone knows who everyone else is.
Yes.
So I know how to react to you, you know how to react to me. Just
Well, I treat everyone the same, so.
Yeah. Let's see this if it was less clear cut.
Right. So, right. First, we could call this an objection, which is just the setting is so diverse. The social worlds are so diverse. What about in more intermediate cases? And we'll get to that too. Yes. All right. So I need to combat setting, and I need to combat the personality objections. Okay. How can I possibly do that? How could I take it? I mean, I can't just take a Supreme Court justice and put them on the tennis court, and change the setting. But here's an idea. So let's move to a totally different domain forecast by my little Wikipedians, which is why I asked you if you could tell what they were. Okay. On Wikipedia, it turns out there's a lot happening behind the scenes. If you don't know it, it's fascinating data for people who are interested in social interaction and the like. So Wikipedians behind the scenes, they have these talk pages, both individual ones and per article, and they're sitting around talking about things like, what should we do with this article? What kind of policy should we institute? Who should become an admin and who shouldn't? Okay, so there's a rich set of conversations happening, and even though it's a very large group, so we have 240,000 exchanges here, it's actually, I was about to use a bad word, but we're being taped. This is very hard to parse, but we have it for you. It's available on Chris John's homepage. And so, first of all, very different setting for the Supreme Court. It's online instead of face-to-face. It's asynchronous. These are totally different people. Most of them are normal human beings. Some of them are bots, Okay, but they're definitely not kind of Supreme Court justice type people. Okay. Now, what about the thing about personality? Okay, if I have the same person, I can argue that person has relatively the same personality throughout life, roughly speaking. So it turns out that in Wikipedia we have cases where the same person can change their social status with respect to other people. There are transparent elections that happen in front of everybody by which someone can be nominated for, run for, and hopefully be elected to become an admin. So an admin has higher status than the people who are not admins. Okay, so what do we have here? This one here, corresponding to the blue line, is someone who's going to stand for election as an admin. This little group of little Wikipedians is the hoi polloi, the other people. This axis here is time, and this yellow bar represents when this admin who stood for election becomes crowned king or queen, or really admin. Okay, so this time axis is showing there's a change of status that happens right here. Same person, change in social role. Okay, what happens to the level of coordination? This is level of coordination again. We see that when this person achieves the higher status by being ruled an admin, their level of coordination with everyone else drops significantly. Conversely, the people who had been talking to that person and not coordinating so well, their level of coordination with that person goes up when that person becomes of higher status, has more power over them. How are we doing?
What is the admin being coordinated to?
The other,
Just everything?
yes. So all these are averages, which is where the bars are coming from. Yeah. It's actually a huge community. So how do you find out that someone's an admin? Well, eventually you find out, but it's not like there's a whole, yeah. So usually on their page, there'll be and some people actually are voting on these things, and so they know because they're following the election, but there's a huge number of Wikipedias, so it takes a little while for the news to get out. Usually I get the question, go ahead.
So I'm trying to understand the group of, the comparison group that you have with red dashes. Why is their level of coordination initially lower?
That's the question I always get.
Past and future admins?
Yes, so this is interesting. So it turns out there is a personality component to this, and that's important to note. People who tend to win adminship tend on average to coordinate more than the average Wikipedian, as it happens in our data. Which is interesting. It could be that these are people who are going to be better admins because they pay attention to what other people are saying. What a concept, right? In fact, something we found, and I can't remember if this is in the paper or not, we also looked at the people who lose the elections. And it turns out they start here. And when they lose, they go up. Right? Which seems to be another confirmation of this idea that when you're in power, and especially when that power relationship is emphasized, or lack of power in this case, the level of coordination is moving along with it. Which I think is pretty cool. All right. Then there's another objection I'll come up to. I don't know. Do people seem happy with this? I could just go, you accepted that first slide and just move on. I don't know. Well, here's one. This is one that bothered me for a long while, which is you could be like, if I wanted to know who's a Supreme Court justice and who isn't, there's a lot easier thing I could do than go through all their transcripts, see what they said. What is it? I'm a smarty pants. What's my smarty pants answer? Yeah. I don't look it up, perhaps on Wikipedia, right? So these are org chart kind of social relations, power relationships. There are easier ways to find out than looking at their language. So I'd like to know, well, does this stuff actually work for the hard cases where, maybe I don't have an org chart, so I have to resort to their language. Dun, da, da, da. New study here, going back to the Supreme Court again, but taking advantage of a kind of odd fact, if you will, about the U.S. Supreme Court sort of ecosystem. So it turns out, in general, lawyers going before the Supreme Court tend to know how the justices are going to vote ahead of time. The justices have sort of, not exactly a broadcast, but it's sort of well known which way they're leaning. Okay, which means an attorney arguing before the Supreme Court can be facing two different kinds of Supreme Court justices. Those who are predisposed to vote their way, and those who are to vote their way, and those who are predisposed to vote against them. Okay, now if we put this in Emerson's exchange theoretic terms, we would say that if you need something from someone, that person has power over you. And if you need something more from someone, they have more power over you. We can adapt this to this setting by saying, well, if I'm an attorney, I have the person who is predisposed to vote against me has more power over me because I have to work harder to change their minds, hopefully. Okay? So this is not an org chart thing. This varies from case to case. So the same person can be sometimes have the same justice can be for me or against me in different cases, and hence I can have a different power relationship with them. Here we have the same kind of thing then, and what are the results? In this case, the purple bars are attorneys talking to justices who they need more. They need to change their vote, versus the justices talking to the justices who they already had in their pocket, so to speak, and so they need them less. And again, the same thing across the aggregated measures. We see the purple bars are above the green bars, statistically significant difference. Okay?
So across all classes, there's one in there.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you know if sort of given lawyers, if given lawyers have a tendency to fall into to encounter unfavorable and favorable justices with equal probability, or it's like there are certain lawyers who are lawyers that argue unfavorable cases?
It tends to be not that way so much as there are cases that are sort of have a liberal versus conservative side, and there are liberal and conservative justices. So if there are more cases that come up with a liberal protagonist, if you will, then it'll be like that. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So you might imagine a kind of triage effect where there are people whose minds I just can't change.
Yes.
And so I'm not talking to them. So you might expect if you did a three-way thing here,
Yep.
you'd be talking to Justice Kennedy.
Yes. So we checked.
Yeah.
And it turned out, and this I can't explain, just can't explain it. Things are much less simple than they always look. They don't seem to coordinate more to Kennedy, even though he's a known swing vote. However, the first thing that you said brings up a very interesting thing. You said they're the people who are going to change their mind versus the person who will never change their mind. So who is not represented in this data? Clarence Thomas. Why not? He never says anything. Why is that? So there are many possible factors, but one thing Clarence Thomas says as to why, it was actually newsworthy, I think about a year ago, he actually said something. They're not sure what he said, but he said something, and this went to the New York Times. But anyway, one reason he says he doesn't participate in these things is that he says the oral arguments are useless. My colleagues are just using this to show off. They never change anyone's mind. And there's a line of sort of this jurisprudence research that also argues this, that the oral arguments don't actually change anyone's minds. And so people have actually been saying maybe we should cancel them. Although there's some issues with sort of transparent government and the thing like that. So just there's a deeper point here. Is anyone actually going to change their mind? I don't know.
Well, hope springs eternal. So what you might be able to do
Does it?
is track, by looking at, spreading this graph out over a time axis, track whether I, the lawyer, think that I have a hope
I
of change.
could try doing that.
How hard am I trying?
Yeah. So there are a lot of possibilities when you get into the subtler stuff. I hope that we've showed that the coarse grain stuff seems to be holding, and therefore encourage you to go and investigate the kind of finer grain stuff. I think there is a huge amount here, but then lots of things get kind of complicated. Like why don't they accommodate to Kennedy? I don't actually know. It could be very situational stuff. Because in the end, there are only two chief justices represented and only 9 people on a time, kind of thing. On the one side, there's small data issues, sort of. But,
well, maybe just the feedback that they get from Kennedy or something, like there's a lot of interpersonal dynamics.
Yeah, which happens afterwards. I would love, right. So in fact, I've been talking to a guy, if you will, he's a political science professor, about getting the drafts of the opinions and the opinions on the draft. So unfortunately, this involves actually going down to the Library of Congress and spending 3 months scanning them. But he says he's willing to do it, but we'll see. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of things this potentially opens up, and I'm thinking about some of them, but some of it's incredibly intensive work. I hope we've proven the main points we set out to prove. Yeah, let me take your question and move on.
I mean, it may in some ways be related to be the same as Jason's point about the person you first want. But I guess I'm wondering, so these are, you can think of them as unconscious persuasion tactics.
Yep.
So do you get the same kind of coordination with people that you're not trying to persuade, but who are, so if you don't have a stake in anything, but they are your boss.
So Christian, in the previous paper where they defined the coordination measure, was looking at Twitter, where it's sort of really open, and they are finding coordination effects, but since they weren't looking for a separation between one and the other, obviously they didn't find it since they weren't looking for it. So you do see that kind of coordination. I honestly I wanted to do this on consequential conversations because I thought it would matter more, so you would more see it. So I actually don't have a hypothesis whether you see it so much instead of regular kind of things. Honestly, I don't know. But I sort of thought, well, application-wise, I could see why I want to do this on the bigger side. OK, I'm going to skip your question and move on just so that I know there's lunch people want to eat and things like that. So I'll take your question maybe later. All right. Oh, yeah. I should probably prove to you that this isn't just correlation, but actually there's some prediction performance improvements that can be had. OK, so far we showed that there's a correlation between this level of coordination and telling whether who's in charge, but we haven't shown that some other measure couldn't have done a lot better. OK, so here are some results. I'm most interested in the hypothesis I put forward that these coordination measures are domain independent and so are going to work better instead of cross-domain settings. OK, so let me walk you through this graph. Suppose we train on Supreme Court data and test on Supreme Court data. What I'm giving you are two people and everything they've said to each other. And based on that, you have to decide which of them is in charge. OK, so you get a 50-50 random choice baseline. This axis here is difference for 50%. So if you're at 0, you're doing it random choice. If you're at 50, that means you're getting everything. You can always tell who's in charge. This bar here is bag of words. It's doing spectacular, basically perfect. How come? What? Things like Your Honor, right, back row? Yeah. Whereas, so this is a coordination feature. What the star means is, are you significantly better than baseline? So with these coordination features, we're significantly better than baseline, but we're getting our pants beaten off. Something's wrong with that construction. We're doing much worse than bag of words, so at least we got the star. This is if we use the function word classes, but don't care about the interaction. OK, so it does matter that you're talking about the interaction and the echoing, as opposed to just using function words at all. OK. But I always, when there's blank space on a slide, it always means more is coming when it's respect to me. Suppose we switch to talking about training and testing on Wikipedia. Suddenly, bag of words doesn't look so good anymore. In fact, it's doing it at random chance. It's because it's a lot harder to tell based on the unigrams or whatever that people are using. Whereas the coordination features, at least you got the star. OK? Now what if we do this cross-domain stuff? Train on the Supreme Court, test on Wiki, or train on Wiki, test on Supreme Court. How is bag of words doing? It stinks. How come it stinks?
Nobody calls because of Your Honor on the video.
Yeah, it's overtraining, right? Overfitting. Whereas the coordination features are the only ones that retain their star and stay above that 50% baseline. It's always statistically significant no matter what you're training on, et cetera. I think the point is clear. OK? Now, these aren't maybe so huge over 50%, but you're certainly doing way better than bag of words. And I'm not saying that we use the best way to do this. Notice that, for instance, bag of words with a 20,000 feature space, we're only using 9. Yeah? OK. Let me move on. But I hope this has convinced you that not only was there a correlation, but there's enough information in these features that it can actually be practically useful, even over, you know, your good old SVMs with bag of words. Do you have a really quick question?
Yeah, so the bar means that you're doing like 55 or 57% rate?
Yep, but that's only 9. Presumably you could do better if we'd done fancier stuff. I'm just trying to make the simple point that you can do better than, yeah. All right, let me move on to this question of whether phrasing affects the memorability of things. And you're supposed to remember this lipstick on a pig, the question of why did this catch on? Was it the phrasing or was it all what was going on in the world? OK. Basically, why am I interested in this? Again, it sort of gets down to faculty meeting again. I want to know how come it is when I say something, it doesn't get picked up. When my colleague next to me says it in a different way, and everyone's like, oh, they're so smart, we should do that. Right? It just happens all the frickin' time. So it matters to me personally. You can also imagine for things like studying Twitter, influence, diffusion on social media, blah, 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 blah. You know where I'm going. OK. Now, how might we study this question? I've already raised the issue that there's some experimental problems. First of all, what kind of data can we use? So I know about this lipstick on a pig example. I know about palling around with terrorists, and I could probably think of the vitals of our economy are strong, but trying to think of what goes viral isn't a way to get enough data, you know, get a large amount of data. I mean, there are ways around this, but there were some complications here. What does that actually mean for something to be memorable? Just because it has a huge number of counts on Google or whatever, that could be just because everyone picked it up because they are following AP Newswire. That's another technical problem. The main problem here is how do we tease apart a language effect from just context or other stuff that's going on? And that's the key question, right? I want to know if there's a language effect no matter what else is kind of going on around this thing that was said. And it seems like, how could you separate language from context? That would be so weird. All right, so the first problem we got around by sort of saying, well, what are sort of pieces of language that people care deeply about? It turns out many people care deeply about movie quotes. These things go massively viral. Your friends may have used one with you in conversation in the last month, I would guess. In fact, people care about these so much that back when there was such a thing as TV, CBS had a 3-hour special just about famous movie quotes, the most famous movie quotes in all time. People use this with each other a lot. They find them interesting. They have their, it's good cocktail party talk. And it's a larger segment of the population cares about these than necessarily cares about political quotes. Okay, so we have some data. How can we control for speaker and context? I like using this example. So this is from Star Wars Episode 4, the original. Obi-Wan Kenobi is doing this kind of gesture, and he's talking to some stormtroopers. Actually, how many people have seen Star Wars Episode 4? Most everybody, so I still have to explain it, though. So Obi-Wan is doing a Jedi mind trick on the stormtroopers. So he's saying, you don't need to see his identification. And the stormtrooper repeats, I don't need to see his identification. These aren't the droids you're looking for. Stormtrooper repeats, he can go about his business, etc., move along. Okay. What's that?
Pretty good at translating.
Indeed. So did my Jedi mind trick work on anybody? It hasn't. It has never worked in any colloquium I've ever given. Anyway, one of these lines went hugely viral, and the rest didn't. Which one was it? These are not the droids you're looking for. It's become a meme, a highly recognizable meme, a meme people love making jokes about. This one here, I like this one. Here's a little baby stormtrooper with her little army doll or something, and she's saying, bye, Daddy, I hope you find the droids you're looking for. This one over here, what are these stormtroopers doing? They're searching on Google for the droids we're looking for. Right? And this one, most appropriate for this talk, we do other things besides look for droids, but that's all anyone ever remembers. This joke wouldn't make any sense if people didn't all remember that line, right? And it's very hard to picture such a joke being made about, we do other things besides look for identification, but that's all anyone remembers, right? It's really based on how viral that particular segment was. Okay, so we have our data. We have these movie quotes that go viral because people store them on things like the IMDb. They mark down they write down what are the memorable lines. Okay. What can we pair them with? So in that previous scene, this is important. We're looking, the comparison I did were with lines said by the same person in the same scene at the same point in the movie. Well, I guess that's redundant. At the same scene, spoken by the same person, right? So that's controlled for the context because the same thing was going on. The same person said it, okay, but one of them went viral and the other ones didn't, okay? So that's the kind of pairing we're going to look at. We're going to pair the memorable quotes, these are not the droids you're looking for, with a line that's adjacent in the script, either above or below, about the same length, spoken by the same speaker. So you have all these as many controls as we could think of for all the context in that. So you're hoping to focus just on the language effects. And if you like, you can play with the data. It's available on Christian's homepage. Now, it's best if I give you an example to give you an idea of what are these things. Because people are sometimes like, well, people have heard these quotes anyway. They're in the air or whatever. So this is the actual kind of data that we used. We can do a little test here. So each row is a pair. The question is, which of them became memorable and which of them didn't? Okay? I'm going to assume you haven't seen these movies. Okay? And probably you don't recognize those quotes. Okay, so importantly, we asked people to classify each of these pairs, well, to classify the items in each pair for movies they haven't seen. Again, because we're trying to eliminate all those contextual effects. They don't know how it was said. They don't know what was happening at the time. All they have is the language. Okay, so let's see how the room does. This is my first pair. How many people say the left hand for Jackie Brown was the more memorable? Jason, how come you're always the first hand up? It's like this cascade effect. I'm a little suspicious. How many people say the second one? Okay. For Star Trek Nemesis, how many people say left hand? How many people say right hand? No one? No cold feet or any other parts of your anatomy. Come on. All right. How about left hand and ordinary people? I mean, there's some right hand side. Okay. How easy was this task? You don't test. There seem to be strong tendencies, but you don't agree, right? So I'm trying to give you a flavor for the fact that you kind of feel, maybe you can get a feeling for this, but I'd say it's not obvious, right? It wasn't all 100% of you said something. On each one, there was disagreement. Okay. And I'm not actually going to tell you the answer, because I'm that kind of person. And more importantly, I'm trying to get you the feeling that this is a task where you kind of have some intuition, but you're not necessarily sure you're right. Okay. So this is the task. So in our pilot study, we had people do these things, and let me run through you the possibilities with their accuracy. Suppose the people that we ran this pilot study had gotten 50% accuracy. That would have said the task is impossible. So that's random choice. Okay, it says the people looking at only the language could not figure out which became the most memorable. So if people had done 50%, that would have said there is no language effect, right? Thank you. At 100%, that would be trivial. It would say people just have to look at the sentences and they know right off the bat, so to speak. At least they're always right about which is the most memorable. In which case, it's only language. Okay? So how did our studio audience, if you will, do? Our pilot study, the accuracies are right here at the interesting task sweet spot. Namely, they were able to do better than chance. So there was some language effect happening. But they weren't perfect because it's not all language. Right? If I say, I'll be back, nobody particularly cares. Arnold Schwarzenegger says, I'll be back, and, it takes off. Okay, we know there are factors other than the language which affect whether things go memorable, but notice that it's not just the language, and it's not no language effect at all. Yeah?
But, I mean, even if we don't know these movies, and we don't know the context of these quotes, we have a pretty good model of what happens in movies and what...
Well, then, so how come you aren't at 100%?
I guess I'm just saying that I'm just saying that it's more than just the language that we get.
Absolutely. But of course, this is the best we could do. You try to think, can I reduce it as far as I can? I mean, I could have been like, okay, you have to be non-native speakers of English or something. That would have been weird. Okay, so we've done what we can.
Never watched a movie.
Right. That would be also kind of weird. But if we had total key, we're not at the 100% also. So I think the fact that we're right here tells you, yeah.
Do you have them predict things about the context? For example, see how well people do model the context? I don't know, try to subtract that out or after that somehow. You could try to separately measure how well people are at modeling the stuff other than language.
You could have done that, I guess. I'm trying to just reason about it, just sitting here. Yeah. Yeah. See if you want to move forward and say, okay, now I really want to get at how much is the language. Yeah. So you can picture that. But I think we've at least made the point here. Let me just quickly say something about this. So you may be like, why am I talking about a range? Like I can't count or something like that. So as it turned out, this particular study itself went viral. I don't know if people knew about this, but I guess it's the highlight of my professional life. Kathy Lee Gifford made fun of us on the Today Show because of this. So 15,000 people ended up taking our test because it is online, after all, and they scored the 72. So it was a really large-scale study, and there we actually couldn't really control for what these people were doing. One of them comments, I actually remember, they're saying, I speak Italian. Why are you asking me about these quotes in English? Like, why are you on our site? I didn't ask you. There were weird crap going on, but we still got on the sweet spot. Really nice. Yeah, let me take your question for this.
The number is the percent that people were able to get correct, but that's not the same as the inter annotator or whatever you call it. So how much do people agree?
So we couldn't totally check that because they had to have not seen the movie. So each person has a different set of things they've seen or haven't seen, so we would have had to go through and figure out who has seen the exact, So we didn't do it. We figured 15,000 people hit here. I don't really care so much that it's so much as to say that at least I'm not here.
Wondering whether, because it's another way maybe of teasing apart the language versus the context. Because people are actually agreeing on something, but it's wrong. There might be something in the language there that's
it's true.
leading them to think
Yep.
that.
So Yeah. I think in general, we have a tendency to do the early, what do you call the low-hanging fruit and move on? Because you have to make sure there's actually fruit down low first. Does that make any sense? Yeah, I agree that we could have then gone and done some more careful stuff. We probably should have because of some of the preliminary results I'm going to show next. But I think this is a really rich thing to mine. And you know that because you hear, because if we had been here, there would have been no point otherwise. Yeah. Real quick.
What are the chances if I didn't see the movie that I saw the viral quote anyway?
So we just have to trust that we just have enough people and enough data that sometimes they did see it, but it wasn't so much that it hit 100%. If everyone had known about it.
Not that viral is what I was expecting you to say. I mean, I don't think I've seen any of these in viral context, so maybe it's not a worry because when you're detecting a quote that went viral and is memorable, that means it showed up some small number of times and most people didn't see it.
What? I didn't follow that.
$500,000 will always be missed. How many times does that show up on the web? In ordinary random citizen, how likely?
So it shows up at least there's some minimum frequency we require. But of course, web counts are a little weird because they're weird people who write things on the web and blah 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 blah. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of things. Generally, at this point of the talk, I get a lot of things. You could have done this, you could have done this, and I completely agree. There's many, many more things that could have been done. We're certainly not trying to say this is the be-all and end-all. We want it to be sort of inspirational, if you will. Actually, you know what? I'm going to skip all the rest of this, except to say that once you have this kind of result, you can then picture going to town and go, okay, so what are the language features that matter? Okay, and we have some findings. I'll just skim through them very fast, but I would say probably the people here, you guys are Johns Hopkins, you know, you're the master of these things. I'm sure you could find features that beat the pants off of what we did. Okay, because we do have a prediction task in there, blah, blah, blah. But I think maybe the most interesting finding is that if you look at the memorable quotes versus the non-memorable quotes, and you look at the language that's being used. So on average, if you build some lexical n-gram models, you find that the memorable quotes tend to have lower likelihood than their non-memorable pair. Their non-memorable partner, pair partner, whatever, the alternative. Okay, and which kind of makes sense. So it has to have something different about it or people remember it. That's my just so story, but there you go. On the other hand, if you were to take a part-of-speech n-gram language model on these things, then the memorable quotes tended to have higher likelihood than their non-memorable counterpart. So again, you can have a just so story here that it could be that the memorable quotes have something surprising to them in the wording so that they're actually memorable, but in their syntax, they're actually kind of ordinary so that you're able to reproduce them. So that's kind of a story. But these are the kind of features you can look at. I'm going to skip the rest of these and just come here to say something that William Carlos Williams said. He's a poet. He said he wrote something memorable. Red wheelbarrow, white chickens. Oh, man. All right. But he said the following: I had not yet come to the conviction, it is not what you say that matters, but the manner in which you say it. There lies the secret of the ages. Now, I haven't come quite to that conviction, but I have come to the conclusions. Namely, that social power relationships affect language even at extremely fine-grained levels, such as our use of function word classes. Also, our second study, though, that phrasing does indeed have some effect on memorability and engagement of the people. Well, this I had to skip, but we saw on Facebook that more distinctive posts in the language do, under certain technical conditions, tend to attract more comments. Even more, moving a little broader, we could say that improved computational techniques, I believe, for social computational systems is an important broader direction that the field of NLP could be taking. And I view the deeper interplay between constructing NLP-enabled systems. So I put it this way because I'm not saying that Facebook is an NLP system, but Facebook could have NLP components in it that make the user experience better. So the combination between these and understanding how people use and are affected by language, I view these as a huge opportunity for all concerned. Now, maybe that's not so memorably phrased. It goes on a little while. Maybe a better way to put it is, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Thank you very much. I don't know if we should let everyone go or... So again, let me make a meta point here. I always try to present the simple case first, and then always, there are many elaborations of many paths we could have taken, and I really welcome the feedback. And that would be cool, but of course there was only so much time, so we tried to do the simple case first. Yeah.
one of the things that I thought of when you were talking about the coordination is that by looking at function words, to some extent, what you're maybe looking at is syntactic priming. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about the connection between this work and the syntactic priming literature, which of course is not about power dynamics or anything else. It's just about.
So while I expect there's some priming effects, it would be hard for a priming account to account for just the one thing, gibberish. So, for example, this was actually one of the original studies in this sort of direction. Hannah Baker and Ireland, I think, looked at Watergate transcripts, and they looked at Nixon versus his associates. And in particular, Dean used to be kind of very close and in with Nixon, and then later, as things went on, the relationship went sour. And what you start seeing is that, and again, this is small scale, not particularly quantitative, but Dean starts discoordinating from Nixon on various aspects, although also over-coordinating on other feature classes. So I think the story is definitely way more than just social relationships, first of all. I think attention is part of it. So I am having a furious argument with you. You know, I'm not really in sync with you. We're not meeting, it's not a meeting of the mind, but I sure as hell am paying attention to what you're saying. So, so I think there's an awful lot going on here besides just the social relation. But I do think that priming would have a hard way, it would be hard for priming to account for the divergence that we see.
Well, so I'm not actually suggesting that priming could account for it. I'm actually thinking maybe in the other direction, maybe the syntactic priming people, what they're actually finding and calling syntactic priming is maybe sort of a subset of what you're finding. I mean, could that literature be entirely explained by this?
So I've been talking to various psychologists, and I don't really understand the social thing that's going on about what different camps think. So I can't quite follow what's going on there. But it would be interesting to know. We've actually done some stuff. The reason I had the movie scripts in there is that one thing we try to do is look at these imagined conversations where you can try to distinguish the priming effect from the social interaction, because there's no other social to be interacting with. But that was very preliminary work.
Yeah. I mean, I guess something else you could look at also is just because you've just been looking at function words, but if you had a parser, you could actually also look at the abstract syntax
I'm sure
and see whether you get coordination.
I'm sure you get coordination just in length. So we drilled down to function word class in part because it was inherently interesting. If you want to go back and get if you want to go back and say just what are the coordination signals I want to look at, probably length would do quite a bit away. It wouldn't require parsing at all. I haven't checked it, but I have. Yeah.
For the power relationships, I was curious. So far, at least everything that was on the slides that you showed us, there was an explicitly delineated difference in powers. There were some justices, and there were some attorneys, there were some advocates, and there were some non-advocates.
So not in the third one, where there were justices, but some of them were pro your case and some of them were against your case.
So I guess my question is, would this be moving in a direction where we have, let's say we have a method for it, and it's just a bunch of users that are all in the same class, but some of them have been around for longer or whatever. They have more respect, kind of a more latent distinction between them and other users. Is moving in a direction where we would be able to predict those kinds of
So it'd be interesting to see. I need the gold standard labels to check, and that's always the catch.
In the beginning, we were talking about sentences with just like one or two functional words, right? That you compared. Does this result hold when you get to like longer sentences with more of these things, or does it break down?
So it's not like we control the length of the sentences, and in the Supreme Court, some of them go on very long, even with the sentence.
Yeah, I'm just imagining like if somebody says something that takes a while, somebody talks for half a minute.
There's kind of a thing. So you might have noticed, those who are really keeping track at home, that we didn't run this stuff on Enron. And you might have been like, that's the obvious corpus. Everyone uses it. So one thing is everyone is using Enron for social relationship kind of stuff. Technically, not technically, sort of intuitively, I have an issue with, so for these really long things like emails, it's not even clear to me you read the whole thing. So would a lack of accommodation mean, would a lack of coordination mean a social relationship is breaking down, or would it just mean I didn't read the parts? So I'd like to concentrate on this kind of thing in part because at least I have some guarantee you probably heard the whole thing. But it would be interesting to know. So, I mean, it could just be run.
Yeah, I'd just be even if you're talking about something like someone mentioned, talking about a forum, right? And you're just comparing posts that are a couple of sentences long. Do you see the same sort of mimic rate?
I don't think we ever looked explicitly. It could be done.
Right, because I mean, I would be interested to see, which it was, because I can see it going either way.
You're welcome to it. It's all online. It's all available. All this data is available. Yes, all this data is available. Yeah. Yeah, so that's what I said. Is I'm sure you'll see a correlation.
And so would these also generalize to multiple people? And so, like right now, one-to-one, would these measures similarly generalize to
So the Wikipedia conversations are actually in some senses multi-party. So we're just doing adjacent kind of things.
But it's been parsed in such a way that when you're looking at the person who will, so you're looking only at one person and how.
So that's the test setup. But the data itself is also a multi-party conversation. But we only ask the question for this pair of people, just because, I mean, I'm not going to look at the whole ranking of it. Take 6 people, what's the, so just to prove the point, we first ask for a given pair of people that are in a conversation, can I tell them?
And last part is, when you check the baseline, when there was no difference in power relation, what was the difference in coordination?
I mean, in a sense, the Wikipedia admin one shows that, because you see, the people, talk about before they coordinated, you see, the people who, there are personality differences. There are people who tend to win these elections, they tend to have a higher level than the people who lose these elections. I believe there are personal differences in how much people pay attention to each other, are able to do this. So I'm sure there are differences that also aren't based on the social role or a power relationship. That just seems clear also. Let's finish with Miles.
A cute question.
Oh, a cute one.
Let's say I'm a naughty person and I'm aware of your work. Right? Will it be possible for me to manipulate the conversation and make you think I'm in charge?
So don't think I haven't tried this in capital media. I find it very hard to alter my function word. I can't even tell in real time how many are. So I think it'd be a little hard to do, but it's certainly the case that, never mind why I know this, but there are these various dating sites on the web that say echo their movements. It'll prove you're in sync. It is, some people believe there is, people make inferences based on this kind of correlation.
So the more serious sort of question, I guess this would relate to advertising. So I'm trying to convince your authorities.
Yes. So I'm definitely interested in influence, and I'd be curious to see. So we do know things like in the lab, where they have done things to be able to control level of coordination. There is a difference in how people evaluate others based on how much they're coordinating. Whether this actually translates all the way to believing more what they said, I don't know. Probably, unfortunately, the way people are wired. Anyway, we should definitely let people go to lunch at this point. Thank you again.